Welcome, John. It's so very nice to have you with the House of Beautiful Business
No,
speaking
thank
on
you
these
very
topics.
much. It's a great. I try and say no, I try and say no to 99.999% of any opportunities to do this, and I have to say it's so compelling what you guys do. So I have been drawn into your world. So thank you for having me.
Well, at any rate, I mean, I was thinking about speaking to you today, and I was thinking about how during the extraordinary period that we are living through, I am, as a psychologist and a psychotherapist, speaking to so many people who are becoming far more aware of their interconnection with others, their reliance on others, their relationship with themselves and their values, and of course, also becoming more aware of their relationship to the natural world and indeed to the foods that we eat. And I know that there's been some research conducted by the Food Standards Agency that indicates that a lot of people are experiencing a really positive reawakening to all sorts of things around, kind of food acquisition and food preparation and how we kind of relate to the foods that we eat and the producers that bring it to us. And so it's really a time that a lot of us are becoming much more mindfully aware. This is my impression, and I'm wondering about yours.
It's funny that you should, as you were asking the question, it made me realize that the first form or door, there are four, of Wing Chun, is about becoming conscious, and it is about becoming aware. And I think that for most of us, the pause, the circuit breaker, I don't mean circuit breaker as in the defense against the disease, but the circuit breaker, life circuit breaker that this has given many people when they perhaps have spent more time with their family, they spend more time at home. They've probably spent a little bit more time either missing nature or connecting with it. It is a little bit like the first door of Wing Chun, because the first door of Wing Chun is a form in which you stop and you become conscious, and you go from being unconscious and just going with everything because you're so busy and you're not questioning anything, to a situation in which you suddenly pause and you face yourself. There's a phrase in the martial art Wing Chun, which is about Ju Ming, which is to go face to face yourself. And the form is almost done like looking in a mirror. And I think that's what many people have experienced. They're thinking, oh, the assumptions that we made as a society, the assumptions that I made about my life, they might have been nagging at me subconsciously. And looking back on it, I always had these questions, but I never had time to really answer them about how I want to eat, or how I want to spend my time. Do I want to spend all of this time grasping, or do I want to be living in the present moment in a way which I have maybe lost since the age of 17 or 18? So I think that's certainly happening.
Tell us a little bit, for the uninitiated, you speak about Wing Chun in your book, and for a lot of people are familiar with various types of martial arts, but that wasn't one that that was so familiar to me. So could you unpack a little bit more your discovery of it, your relationship to Wing Chun, and how you are applying it to broader life in what you write about in your book?
And may I just give just a 2-second summary of what it is?
Absolutely. I'd love you to start with that. That would be my ideal scenario.
Yeah, okay. So what is it? It's actually a form of Kung Fu, and it was the Kung Fu that Bruce Lee practiced or did. And it is fundamentally about not fighting. So it was developed by one of the three founders, one of the three people that were around at the inception, or when it was formalized, were women. And so it has deep Taoist and Zen Buddhist and even Confucian principles. And it marries some of the disciplines of Confucianism with some of the thinking and bias towards wholeness and lack of ego that Taoism has. And it's from the Shaolin Temple, the southern Shaolin Temple in China, where you had this great mix of monks from all these different disciplines, many of whom were women. So it was a very liberal community where you were able to practice Taoism alongside Zen Buddhism or Confucianism, but you were able to also invite people from different walks of life. And so it has, on the one hand, an eclectic philosophy behind it, but they turned it into something very systematic physically and very systematic in terms of the journey that you go on in the 4 forms or 4 physical forms of the art. Forms are like katas in karate, but instead of having hundreds, we have 4 fundamental, only 4, very systematic. Know yourself, bridge with others, free yourself, and then go back to being unconscious in the present moment. So that's basically what the idea is. That everything is very relaxed in the form, in all the martial arts. The defense is very relaxed. The attack is very relaxed. You don't put tension in your body, and therefore you're not engaging your fight or flight response. You're not engaging with fear. You're not engaging with ego, and therefore you are trying to all the time de-escalate conflict. When I'm with Julian, my teacher, and someone, cuts him up in the road, he'll wind his window down and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, that was my fault." Just to de-escalate. And it's incredible what we can achieve if we are not escalating a situation because of our insecurities. I think there's a great phrase, which is, judge people's actions by their insecurities, not by your insecurities. And I think that I think it's very important within Wing Chun to recognize that. And so I came across it. I had an amazing coach. I talk about this in the book, actually, an amazing coach called Amy. And she said, "You know what, John, I enjoyed our first session, but something occurred to me. I listened to the recording." She said, "You talk all the time about being the general of an army. You do know, don't you, that you're not actually the general of an army?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I hadn't really..." Oh, hold it, a phone call. Let's give it to that. Who's that calling me? Nick, I'm doing a thing about wholeness. I'll speak to you later. It's complicated. I'll call you later. Cheers, bye. Anyway, so we'll turn that off. There we go. We'll turn the phone off. There we go. That's how whole and connected we all are today.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say there's some sort of metaphor in here.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, synchronicity. So where were we? So
you're not the general of the army.
Yeah, so you're not the general of the army. And I was like, oh my gosh, she goes, look, if that metaphor works for you, carry on. But if there are maybe downsides to that metaphor, maybe rethink them. And she gave me an alternative metaphor, which was about a guy called Arthur Stace in Sydney, who just got up and wrote the word eternity. He went to church on a Sunday, and his preacher or vicar said, "Eternity, eternity, if only I could preach eternity to everybody in Sydney." And apparently he'd never written in his life, so the story goes. And yet when he tried to write the word eternity, it was in beautiful copperplate writing. So he was a mystery man that used to write the word eternity in really strange places in Australia, right? And it ended up in bells that were being, in storage, and in the Sydney Olympics, the word eternity was on the bridge in the 2000 Olympics. And that was why, because it became a conversation piece. And the metaphor that she was giving me was, why don't you shrink your activity to something which is within your control? So rather than thinking you are the general of an army with inevitable constraints, inevitable fights, inevitable depletion of resources, running out of food, all of those things that come with being the general of an army, why don't you shrink your activity to something manageable that will be within your own, that supports your nature, that supports your well-being, but may have just as much impact.
So when you came upon, Wing Chun and started to know it more and practice it more, tell me how this fed back into your leadership of Leon and all the other things that you're involved in. Pull it together for me.
So just to finish up very quickly on how I got to, because I didn't, By the way, there was this hilarious thing called the Two Ronnies. Do you know the Two Ronnies?
Oh yeah, yes,
Yeah.
I do.
There was this mastermind sketch where he answered the question before, and I feel like I'm guilty of doing that a little bit. In this, I'm answering a wrong question. Therefore, I'm a question behind it. So it's totally my fault. So therefore, I haven't finished telling you about how I got into Wing Chun. So after Amy helped me with that, I read a book by an Aikido teacher called George Leonard about mastery. And he said, look, there are dabblers, there are hackers, there are obsessors, and there are masters. So I wanted to find an Aikido teacher, but I couldn't find one. So I went to a charity event and I bid for a Wing Chun teacher because it looked similar. I'm so glad I did, because I love Wing Chun. And then I had a lesson with this teacher, and at that point, the whole thing opened up for me. And I realized that all of the things I had subconsciously felt about conflict and subconsciously felt about fighting were encapsulated in Wing Chun. So we had these giant post-its on the walls, and he started putting these things up saying, stay relaxed, take the shortest line. Once you have momentum, keep moving forward. Things like never attack, but always hit first. All of these really strange dualities, right? And so I started thinking, wow, not only are those useful in a Wing Chun or a martial arts perspective, these clearly have philosophical impacts. And so rather than just saying they have business impacts, they have life impacts. And because business is part of life, then of course they had business impacts in terms of how to lead, how to not be the hero leader, how to be the servant leader, how to simplify everything. Because I mean, in Wing Chun, it's a very simple martial art. It's not a series of orchestrated moves like a dance. It is a very serious, focused series of simple moves.
I was imagining a sort of a typical coffee shop scenario at a very busy time of day, and sometimes you go in and there is that kind of frenetic quality. Here's multiple people moving around behind the counter, and it's happening, and it's very, and the tension that occasionally is there in that. And I can absolutely see what you're talking about in terms of the value of being able to, there's a lot that's in common with, kind of the mindfulness kind of acceptance sort of, kind of space. But it's amazing when, as you say, there's been things that you've been aware of, maybe a bit subconsciously conscious of, and then you arrive at something that offers you a framework and a philosophy and a roadmap to just consolidate things, and not just consolidate, but then take you forward from there so that you can develop it within yourself and find ways to extend it into all these other, things and for other people.
It's really fascinating you say that about going into a restaurant, because a good ops manager, a regional manager, or a country head of a restaurant chain will be able to go into a restaurant and feel immediately whether this is a restaurant that is in flow. Because actually, a restaurant which is in tension, as in not intention as in intention, but in tension, a restaurant where people are fighting or where they are on edge, is not helpful for the team, and it's not helpful for the customers, is it? And so sometimes you can go into a Leon, you can think, whoa, things are on edge here. People are slightly in conflict, or they are stressed. But when you go into a Leon, and it's almost like ballet, and we used to train, even before Wing Chun, we did something called the shoe game, which was for Ludgate Circus, our second restaurant. We did this game every day where you take a shoe off, and then you would put all the shoes in the middle, and then you'd grab a shoe, and you'd all have to throw the shoes at the same time and catch them at the same time in order to eventually get the right shoe back to the right person. And that trains you on peripheral vision. Because what happens under tension is we're trained to focus on something right in front of us. And so when we are chronically in fight or flight, which most of us are these days, you lose the peripheral vision and the creativity. And you obviously don't digest, right, as well, and all that sympathetic stuff that happens with our nervous system.
Mm. No, absolutely. Johann Hari in his book Lost Connections, where he talks about several disconnections that are kind of at the root of a lot of human suffering. One of the disconnection, including disconnection from the self,
Yeah.
disconnection from our feelings, and disconnection from nature. And
Yes.
and he talks about just how powerfully these strong dividing lines that you're talking about
Yeah.
kind of affect us individually and as a society. So I'm aware of time, and I think we're kind
Sure.
of getting to the point where we are going to wrap this fascinating conversation up. Although I'm sure there is a lot more that we can say. It's fantastic talking to you.
Well,
Just
it's
to bring
been
us
great.
round
I'd
to our
really appreciate it. I know you feel free to ask another thing, but I have to
yeah.
say I really appreciate being interviewed by a psychologist and a psychotherapist. It's really amazing to be able to, as someone who isn't a psychologist or a psychotherapist, someone that has tried to learn and understand psychotherapy through the lens of Wing Chun and the lens of business. I really actually welcome the opportunity to talk to you about it, actually.
Oh, and reciprocally, as a psychologist who for years kind of worked very much within the bounds of the consulting room on an individual level, and it was kind of a weird thing for me last year when I participated in the House of Beautiful Business, because a, a gathering focused on business wasn't something that I was accustomed to. And I think that I'd underestimated the kind of reciprocal value that my kind of field and that kind of field could bring to one another. And one of the brilliant things about the House of Beautiful Business is its openness and its willingness and its curiosity about how these seemingly, but actually not so disparate threads can be pulled together and woven together in a way
Absolutely.
that's of mutual benefit. And I think that that's why it's so fantastic that you're able to speak to the House and within this topic as well, because what you were doing at Leon and what you were thinking about and practicing with Wing Chun, is an example of that. It's an embodiment of how these different threads can be woven together in a way that isn't in opposition to business success, but that is actually promoting and facilitative of business success and a positive experience for the consumer and for the people involved with the
Absolutely. And I
company.
think the more we recognize and understand ourselves, the more we realize our connection with others. And the big thing that I've tried to explain to Leon is we are not in competition with anybody. In Leon, I say there are no competitors. If you try and say, oh, you need to be better than them, then you're going to be more like them. And therefore, the consumer is not going to start to understand the difference between you and them. But if you know yourself as a business and you define yourself as wanting to be the best of your own uniqueness as a business, then you're not drawn into conflict and comparison with and similarities with and copying others. And I think that's key. But, that's, Leon is a long-term thing, and we're suffering right now because of, what's happening in London, that we're having to put all the principles of Wing Chun into not going bankrupt, because we have 50% fewer customers than we did a year ago. And in a fixed cost business, that's terrible. But we're not panicking. Do you know what I mean? We're not fighting. We're going to find a way through it, through flow.